Hey, what's up, Good Life? Thanks for joining me for today's 128 moment. If you have someone in your life who needs to know Jesus, then this 128 moment is for you. But first, I want us to look at a scene from Paul's life so we can get a glimpse of Paul's heart. And by seeing those two things, hopefully we'll be able to see our moment clearly. On Sunday mornings, we've been walking through the second half of the book of Acts. And the last few chapters of that book and the last few weeks of our series have focused almost exclusively on the painful path that Paul has had to follow as he lived out the Great Commission. And we've seen him attacked by a mob at the temple. We've seen him arrested and tried for crimes he didn't commit. We've seen him marked for death by Jewish religious leaders who wanted nothing more than to wipe him off the face of the earth. And when we left off on Sunday, Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea, and on the surface, he looks little more than a political pawn of powerful people. And once it was clear that a fair trial was a lost cause, Paul exercised his rights as a Roman citizen, and he appealed to Caesar. So while Paul's waiting to be sent to Rome and waiting for his audience with the emperor, he got to meet a king. King Agrippa was the great-grandson of Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the Jewish king who built the temple in Jerusalem. He's the king who interacted with the wise men in the Christmas story. He's also the king who ordered the baby boys killed in Bethlehem, all of them that were 2 years and younger, because he feared this birth of the king of the Jews was a threat to his power. But King Herod and King Agrippa were more puppets than kings. They were rulers who were allowed a little bit of power and a little bit of privilege to help them keep the Jewish population under Roman control. So Agrippa was Jewish by birth, but he was in his position as king because he played nicely with the occupying Romans. So he was in many ways a traitor to God's people. Now, knowing all of that, would you think King Agrippa was a prime candidate for hearing the gospel and surrendering his life to Jesus? Probably not. And in fact, if I was Paul, I may have been closer to giving him a piece of my mind than a piece of the good news. But in Acts 25 and 26, Paul ends up standing before King Agrippa and before the Roman governor Festus, and Paul sees that God-ordained opportunity to share the good news with a king. Paul walked through his backstory of how he was once this zealous persecutor of the church and how on the road to Damascus, going to that city to persecute Christians there, how he'd seen Jesus and how Christ had called him to bring the good news to the nations. And while Paul has retold this story several times in the book of Acts, this time Paul includes more details of what Jesus said than any other time before. It's like Paul pulled out all the stops to make sure he made the most of this opportunity. He's referencing Old Testament law and the prophets. He's passionately trying to convince this jaded king that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, that he died and he rose again. And so Festus stands up and he interrupts Paul at that point, saying he's lost his mind, talking about people rising from the dead. But Paul was undeterred. He doubled down. He looks at King Agrippa and he asks him point blank, "King, do you believe the prophets? I know you believe." And so Agrippa responds to Paul. He says, "In a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul says something really cool. He says, "Whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me would become just like I am, following Jesus, except for these chains that I have around my body." He says, now, this is where we come back to what I told you at the beginning, that if you have someone in your life who needs to know Jesus, then this 128 moment is for you. In this scene, we see the heart of a man who's sold out for the Great Commission. Because Paul is given this opportunity to share the good news, but it seems to us like this moment is a long shot at best. And if we were faced with a similar moment, we might calculate the odds and sort of let the moment just slip by. But when it comes to playing our part in God's big unfinished mission, the odds have nothing to do with our obedience. Here we see Paul standing in chains, unjustly imprisoned, standing before a traitor to God's people, and his only purpose is that no matter what it takes, people need to hear the good news and people need to be saved. So what does that mean for you and for me? Guys, don't worry about the odds of being successful when you share the good news. Just be obedient. Keep praying. Keep sharing. Don't worry about the odds. Don't be deterred by rejection. Don't be discouraged when the time gets long and it starts to feel hopeless. Keep sharing the good news, because that's our part in God's great mission. That person that you know who needs to know Jesus, your job is to keep loving them enough to share the good news. And then you can trust God with the rest. I hope that encourages you guys. I hope it gives you some hope in those relationships you have, those people you know, those people you love who need to know Jesus. God has you in their lives for such a time as this. God has you right where you're supposed to be to make the good news known. So hopefully be able to do that this week, be faithful and obedient in those moments, and hopefully be able to join us on Sunday, 9:30 and 11 at the church, 11 o'clock online, as we wrap up the book of Acts by looking at the end of Paul's life as he arrives in Rome and shares the good news there. I'm excited to walk through that with you. Hopefully be able to see you then, and until then, let's go be a people who will love enough.